Just like the soul shouldn't be contaminated by the demands of the body if you were going to be pure spiritually, so your thought shouldn't be contaminated by your subjectivity and your emotions and your motivations and all of that. Your abstractions should be independent of your
ego. It's defined as a person's sense of self-esteem or self-worth, and in some ways it can be beneficial. It's the little engine that drives our progress in life, but just like you can't put a rocket engine into a street vehicle, we have to keep our egos in check. But sometimes they can grow out of control, and even worse, a huge out of control ego may end up in a position of authority. That's a bad combination, and by the end of this video you'll see several examples as to why. But for now, let's start with the man that started the conversation. Doug Crosby is an MMA judge, an actor, and a stunt coordinator, as well as a good friend of former MMA fighter and podcast host Chael Sonnen. The latter two things will become relevant very soon. Starting with UFC 28 on November 17th of 2000, Crosby has been present as a judge in hundreds of fights, and over time has developed a reputation for giving out bizarre scores. For instance, he gave a 50-45 scorecard in favor of Frankie Edgar in his first meeting with BJ Penn, giving Edgar every single round in an extremely competitive and highly contested fight. He had Li Jingliang losing the first 2 rounds of his fight against Daniel Rodriguez, leading to this display by Li on the MMA Hour. And of course, most recently he gave Paddy Pimblett round 1 of his fight against Jared Gordon right after giving an absolutely flabbergasting 50-45 scorecard in favor of Danny Sabatello in his fight against Rafian Stotts at Bellator 289 the night before. That marked the first time in history a fighter who lost had every single round scored for them and actually prompted an investigation by the Mohegan Athletic Commission. Because of these issues with his judging, a lot of people believe him to be corrupt.
He tries to score fights based on what he thinks the promoter wants. So he scores it for Danny Sabatello because he thinks that that's the guy that they want. He scores it for Paddy Pimblett.
But personally, I'm not so sure. I think that he may simply be insane. While his judging may be strange, it's not the strangest thing about him by far. When you begin to look into Doug Crosby the man, you start to get a sense that something is a little off. For example, after his Frankie Edgar BJ Penn card, he went on an MMA forum called The Underground and created a thread containing an opening post that can be accurately described as word salad. Here are just some excerpts. So I'm wondering, should I tell you how I scored Penn Edgar and why right now up front? But that seems kind of like the Pope or the King back in the day, just writing down what he wants to say and having one of his burly churls nail it to the door of the church for everyone to read. It seems a bit distant, a bit above it all, don't you think? Because God knows I have plenty to say and no shortage of burly churls. No dearth of hulking familiars to do my bidding have I. Perhaps just announcing my presence is enough for now. Perhaps simply allowing some of you, my faithful friends and fellow MMA devotees, to say what you want to say is more democratic, more enlightened, a behavior more consistent with a progressive such as myself. I've met people that spoke like this in high school, and they usually possessed a list of names, if you know what I mean. He's also had less than nice things said about him by fighters and personalities within the MMA space. Here's Ariel Helwani.
I have had personal run-ins, contentious run-ins with him. Once at a computer store in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Once at an event where this guy came after me, verbally came after me and told me that I'm a shit journalist, this, that, because I have talked about him. Everyone has a Doug Crosby story. He's a good friend of Chael Sonnen's. I still don't understand why. This guy should not be judging fights.
Here's former referee Big John McCarthy.
He doesn't talk to me and I don't want to talk to him and I don't talk to him. But I've had blow-ups with commissioners or people over him and his shitty scores.
Ray Longo, head coach of the Cerro Longo fight team, as well as John Anik, a UFC commentator.
This guy's just a rotten human being.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with the judging.
Right.
This guy's got to be looked at for his character, and he has 0. They know that the guy's crazy, man. I mean, listen to all the stuff that's come out on him this week. It's crazy.
One story absolutely tops them all, and that came courtesy of Crosby's friend Chael Sonnen. On On his podcast, Chael, as he often tends to do, goes into a story about his friends Steve and John. The story takes place on the set of the 2008 Mickey Rourke movie The Wrestler, where John plays a referee and Steve is working as a stunt coordinator. John goes into a room and sees a trap door in the middle of the floor. Seeing that as a dangerous liability, he decides to put blankets over the door.
He pulls 2 blankets that are in the room over it, and then he puts his own bag, his travel bag, on top.
Here's where it starts getting weird.
So the next one through the door is Steve. Steve's spidey senses go off. He comes right over, he throws the bag out of the way, he pulls the blankets over the top, he sees the trap door, he opens it up and sees that it's just this dark tunnel of doom, and for reasons unknown, he tells John to get in. John said no, and Steve said, you can either get in the hole or I'm going to put you in the hole. John refuses, so Steve tackles him and is now trying to throw him into the hole. It could literally be his death. So while Steve is wrestling John into the hole and John is fighting to get out, Jared comes in the room. So Jared walks in and just sees this, and Steve looks up and says, put him in the hole. Jared refuses, and Steve says, if you don't put him in the hole, I will fire you. So Jared grabs a towel and hog ties John's feet. The next one through the door is Tommy. Tommy is John's friend, who is only on this set because John introduced him to people in the movie business and brought him along. Tommy's also a great big jacked up pro wrestler. So you would assume when he sees his friend about to go into the hole of death, that some guys are going to get their asses whipped. Steve tells Tommy, help put him in the hole. Tommy doesn't miss a beat, comes over, jumps on top, and starts throwing punches into John, his friend. He starts hitting him in the ribs full speed. So now poor John is hogtied on his lower legs. He's being pushed into the hole with his upper body, and he's got his friend, a 250-pound professional wrestler who's juiced out of his mind, dropping shots on him. So John says now fatigue has set in. He's tired, he's winded, and he realizes, I can't defend myself anymore. Grabs Steve, just grabs a hold of him, and decides, if I'm going in the hole, you're coming with me. Steve at this point reaches into his his pocket and pulls out a buck knife, and he sticks it in John's side and says, if you don't let go of me right now, I'm gonna gut you like a pig. So John does let go of him, and then just something about that made everybody realize this isn't a good idea, and the whole thing stopped. They all get up. John walks outside. He's in tears. He sits down on a bench. His scene is the next one to be filmed, which is about 15 minutes away, so Steve has to go outside to console him to get him back presentable for the camera. And this is where the story is left.
The victim in the story is John Trotsky, a pro wrestler and stuntman, and Steve, if you haven't guessed by now, is actually Doug Crosby. That's been later confirmed by both Chael and John. The story is told from the perspective of Chael, who is on a car ride with Doug and John. It's retold to him in a friendly, joking manner, with Doug not taking any responsibility for his actions at all. In fact, he claims that he was the only one wronged and actually had to work hard to forgive John.
He said, all I wanted was him in the hole. That's all that I wanted. John didn't want to go in the hole, and ultimately he didn't. I wanted him in the hole, and I didn't get that. So there's no hero in this story, but there is a victim, and it's me. But over time, I've forgiven John.
Chael is flabbergasted at the logic and concerned over the severity of what went down. He can't quite come to peace with the events and eventually gets John to admit that he may have Stockholm Syndrome.
101, that's Stockholm. And he goes, it's funny you say that. That's what my counselor said. I've been to more than a few sessions over this.
Stockholm Syndrome is defined as a coping mechanism to a captive or abusive situation where people develop positive feelings towards their captors or abusers over time. There are great in-depth videos on this event on the channel by the name of Zach Riddle. Check it out. It's very entertaining and gives you an in-depth look into the mind of Doug Crosby. There's also a video on Doug Crosby on a channel called Cody Stokes that focuses on the story with a little bit more depth. And if the things in this video are true, then it paints a picture of a man that at the very least is pretty weird. Some have even jumped to conclusions and diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder. Here's how Mayo Clinic defines it. Narcissistic personality disorder is a mental health condition in which people have an unreasonably high sense of their own importance. They need and seek too much attention and want people to admire them. People with this disorder may lack the ability to understand or care about the feelings of others. I'm no psychologist, so I can't confidently say that that's what he has, but based on the description and what we know about Doug, it seems to fit pretty well. But this story isn't just about him. Actually, I'd argue that he's just a minor part of it. What this is actually about is Athletic commissions in mixed martial arts officially hold one primary purpose: protect the fighters as much as possible from both the outside entities like predatory promoters and from themselves through installing rules focused on fighter safety and handing out punishments for any potential violations. They are also responsible for licensing fighters and assigning the referees and judges for each event. They serve a very important purpose but are unfortunately largely unregulated themselves, which opens them up for some major issues. A 2018 article by Joseph Mayol titled "Athletic Commissions: A Case for an Improved Commission Structure for Mixed Martial Arts" puts it like this: "They are rife with systemic problems that have tangible consequences for organizations and, more importantly, the fighters, whether it is the disparity of the agreed upon rule set, the handing down of spectacularly absurd punishments, or just a general lack of knowledge about the sports they oversee. It is almost a unanimous consensus that there need to be serious improvements with how the commissions operate. The most inherent problem with these athletic commissions is that they are mostly composed of appointed bureaucrats who lack the necessary extensive knowledge about the sport they oversee." Of course, that relates to the judging of fights. Unlike promotions and fighters, commissions are extremely protective of their officials. The UFC will drop a fighter with no issue if they mess up badly enough, if they're not too marketable, of course. Paul Daley was released from the UFC after punching Josh Koscheck after the bell at UFC 113 in 2010. Dana White said that he would never fight in the organization again.
He's done. I don't give a shit if he's the best 170-pounder in the world. He'll never come back here again.
We're talking Paul Daley.
Yeah.
You're cutting him from the UFC.
Yeah. He'll never come back.
Since then, Daley never stepped foot in the UFC. With commissions, a judge can have a history of controversial decisions, even in extremely high-profile fights, and get disciplined or reassigned to events with lesser profiles, but never released from their position. For instance, Adelaide Bird, who has a history of absolutely atrocious scorecards in boxing, like her 118-110 scorecard in the 2017 Saul Canelo Alvarez and Gennady Triple G Golovkin super fight, or her scorecard of Amir Khan and Canelo, where she was the only judge to have Khan ahead on the cards prior to him being knocked out, among many others, has no problem getting sanctioned for both MMA and boxing events. The outrage for the Canelo Triple G scorecard was so bad that the Nevada State Athletic Commission's hand was all but forced to discipline Bird, but even then it was simply a slap on the wrist. Bob Bennett, the NSAC executive director in 2017, was quoted by the LA Times as saying, "She'll still be in the business, but she needs to catch her breath. Like any profession, you have a bad night." She has been back judging with no issue ever since, starting with UFC 222 in 2018. But bad scorecards are not the only issue with athletic commissions. In the intro to this video, I talked about unchecked egos and positions of power, and now it's time to explore that further. I'm going to use two examples of absolutely unacceptable behavior courtesy of the athletic commissions, almost certainly caused by bruised egos. The first one is Wanderlei Silva. Back in 2014, Brazilian MMA legend Wanderlei Silva received an unprecedented lifetime ban from the sport by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. To add insult to injury, he was also hit with a $70,000 fine. He wasn't reckless inside of the cage, never put anyone's life in danger, did not test for any banned substances, no. What he did was simply refuse to take a drug test required by the newly introduced US anti-doping agency protocols. At the time, this was a brand new practice and he was only the second fighter to be tested, the first being a man I've already mentioned a lot throughout this video, Chael Sonnen. Here's Chael describing the test.
I was the first guy ever tested in this random out of competition testing, so none of us knew what it was, and you have to take that time into perspective, because now guys understand, look, you get a knock on the door, you must comply. But I was the first one ever we'd never heard of this. In hindsight, I shouldn't have tested. I'm not even sure they were within their rights. So, and this is relevant. They show up, the guy has no ID. Absolutely no identification of who he is.
That's a huge problem.
He then wants to take me into a back room, which ended up being a janitor's closet, not sanitary, a back room at the MGM Grand. He takes me in there where I must derobe and present to him my penis because he watches. You know, now that's a very private thing. Look, and they need to, I understand now, and I think a lot more of us do too, that you have to get naked and do this. You got wisdom, you got all these weird things going on. At that time, though, that's a weird thing. Now, we're in the back of the MGM Grand in a dirty closet, and I'm presenting to a stranger who refuses, not only doesn't offer ID, refused to give ID, and I tried to take a picture of the son of a bitch, and he told me I could not do that.
Credentials are are a reasonable enough ask of someone who is telling you to expose yourself for a test you were completely unaware of. But even if we don't take Chael's word for it and assume that he embellished the story, receiving a lifetime ban for a drug test you never took, while 2 years prior, then UFC heavyweight Alistair Overeem wasn't even out for a full year after showing a testosterone ratio double the permitted amount in a surprise test after the UFC 146 press conference, can only be explained by one thing: ego. The way I personally saw the situation is the NSAC got mad that a fighter dared to even question their authority, so they decided to make an example out of him, something that's eerily similar to how criminal syndicates operate. And while the ban was eventually reduced to 3 years due to public outrage, the fact that they reacted that way in the first place is very telling. My second example of absolutely ridiculous abuse of power comes courtesy of the NSAC's treatment of Nick Diaz after he tested positive for the performance-enhancing drug, wait for it, marijuana. After a decision loss to Anderson Silva, Nick Diaz tested positive for marijuana metabolites. More accurately, 3 separate tests were administered, and Diaz only tested positive in one, testing negative in the first and last. Regardless, the Nevada State Athletic Commission held a hearing to discuss the punishment, during which Diaz decided to plead the Fifth Amendment to every question asked of him, Dave Chappelle style.
5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Seemingly angered by this, the commission decided to hand out one of the harshest punishments ever, suspending Diaz for 5 years and fining him $165,000. This prompted a rant by Diaz outside of the courthouse, where he called the commissioners dorks and questioned why they have so much authority over fighters.
You know, I would tell them what I think. I want to tell them what I think. I want to tell every one of them that they're a bunch of dorks. Like, really, and anybody that sees them or knows who they are should tell them that right to their face. Because I would tell them. I would tell them that. If it wasn't for my experts over here, they advised me to keep my mouth shut. So I kept my mouth shut.
Eventually, an appeal reduced the sentence to 18 months and a $100,000 fine. Again, showing that the NSAC acted emotionally rather than rationally. Nick's opponent, Anderson Silva, tested positive for 2 actual steroids called drostanolone and androstane. Yet he was only banned for a year, retroactive to the fight, which at that point was already 7 months ago. Not that he escaped completely unscathed, being fined his full win bonus as well as 30% of his show money, totaling $380,000. He was also subjected to this gem. Yes, that is a phone going off in the middle of the hearing, playing Shaggy's It Wasn't Me while everyone around laughs. Funny? Sure. Professional? Hardly. And when you consider that it was an MMA legend's career on the line, it's honestly pretty pathetic and makes the regulating bodies look like a joke. Just want to take a moment here and thank you guys for watching my video. The channel has been blowing up lately and I couldn't do it without you. And if you enjoy what I do here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell next to it. I post new videos every single Thursday. If you have your own thoughts on the topic, don't hesitate to leave them down below. I love reading your takes, and if you want to contact me with any kind of questions, collaboration suggestions, topic suggestions, you can reach me by email or you can slide into my DMs on Instagram. With that said, let's finish this up. Whenever there is an issue in MMA, fans and media alike tend to pick one singular figure and blame them for absolutely everything, and in the same way that James Krause became the face of the gambling scandal, Doug Crosby has become that guy for favorable or corrupt judging. Not to the same degree, of course, because this story isn't nearly as big, but definitely in a very similar fashion, and I can't really blame them. Based on everything that we know about him, Crosby is an easy guy to hate, but the fact that he's still allowed to be a judge, even through the terrible descriptions of his character and all of the conflicts of interest, isn't his fault. It's the fault of the athletic commissions. You probably noticed that I mostly mentioned the Nevada State Athletic Commission in this video. That's because they're the most prominent one and the one that judges the most MMA fights. They've also been involved in the most controversies, but unlike what you may assume by the contents of this video, I don't hate them and I don't wish for them to be abolished. abolished. That would lead to an even worse situation, but they should definitely be revamped. No governing body should be allowed to act like a scorned teenager, nor should they be so obtuse as to continue to employ officials that are completely incompetent at best and corrupt at worst. Doug Crosby isn't the problem, he's the result of years of arrogance. Oh, we're the NSAC, no one tells us what to do. Yeah, that's true, but they really should. He's also had less than nice things said about him by the NSAC exec receiving a lifetime ban for a drug test that you didn't even take while only 2 years.
I told you.
But they should. Damn it. Just